Salem, Oregon. A beautiful place with a quiet, small-town atmosphere. Growing up there, you would think nothing bad could ever happen. It was a picturesque city surrounded by lush greenery and peaceful neighborhoods. In one of these spacious, tranquil neighborhoods, a young boy named Chris lived with his parents and his two brothers. Chris was the middle sibling of the three. His brothers both grew up as scouts. His older brother, Scott, was extremely dedicated and worked hard until he finally made it to the prestigious rank of Eagle Scout. His younger brother joined the Boy Scouts too, but he ended up quitting after a while. For some strange reason, their parents never forced Chris to become a scout. This was always a bit weird to him, and he remembered feeling incredibly jealous of his older brother. Whenever their mom would bring Chris along to the Pinewood Derby contests and other celebrations, Chris would sit there watching all the other kids, wishing he could participate. But the thing that made him the most envious was the campouts. The scout troops would head out into the deep wilderness and camp for an entire weekend. Chris went along for the drive once or twice when his parents dropped Scott off. He saw them setting up their gear and preparing the campfires, but since he was younger and not a member of the troop, he wasn't allowed to stay. He had to get back into the car and drive home with his parents, leaving his brother behind to enjoy the adventure. This jealousy grew as Chris watched Scott prepare for these trips. Before every campout, Scott would be given a tent to take home so he could practice setting it up in the backyard. Even though Chris was only 7 or 8 years old at the time, he clearly remembers the day he hatched a plan to experience his own version of camping. He decided they should do a little backyard campout. The idea of setting up the tent in their own yard and sleeping in it overnight was the most exciting thing his young mind could conceive. Their childhood house was located in a very spacious neighborhood. It wasn't a traditional neighborhood with fenced-off yards. Instead, the yards all kind of meshed together, with large patches of trees and thick brush acting as the only dividers between properties. This open layout gave the whole area a wild, natural feel, making it perfect for camping. Their backyard was huge, and it even had a built-in fire pit. Their parents decided to play along with the idea and set up the fire pit so the boys could have the full camping experience. Chris's little brother, who was only 4 years old at the time, joined them to roast marshmallows. Obviously, he was too young to be a scout, and their parents weren't going to let a 4-year-old sleep outside in a tent overnight. As the night grew late, their parents took the younger brother inside and told Chris and Scott it was time to start getting ready for sleep. Back then, the Game Boy SP was the ultimate handheld console. After crawling into their sleeping bags, Chris and Scott pulled out their Game Boys and started playing their games. Chris was completely obsessed with Super Mario Bros. 2, a game he loved but could never seem to beat as a child. The bright screen of the console lit up the dark tent, casting a comforting glow over the brothers as they focused on their screens. Eventually, they started getting tired, and Chris turned onto his side to try and sleep. But he found himself tossing and turning. He was tired, but his mind was restless, perhaps because he had never slept in a sleeping bag before, and it was incredibly uncomfortable. The cold air from the ground seemed to seep right through the thin fabric, making it impossible to find a peaceful position. A massive amount of time passed, and Chris lay there in the dark for what felt like hours before he finally drifted off. When Chris finally woke up, he was disoriented. At first, he didn't recognize where he was in the pitch black. The rustling of the leaves outside and the cool breeze reminded him that he was in the backyard tent. As his eyes adjusted to the dark tent, he realized something was wrong. Scott was gone. His brother's sleeping bag was completely empty. Chris noticed that the tent zipper was fully closed, so he figured Scott must have gotten uncomfortable or cold and decided to go back inside the house. Suddenly, the reality of being completely alone in the dark tent set in, and Chris was gripped by a sudden wave of fear. He didn't want to stay out there by himself anymore. He sat up and unzipped the tent just enough to look outside. But before he crawled out, he decided to do a quick, innocent peek. He was too scared to just run blindly across the backyard without making sure the path was clear. But the path was not clear. As Chris peeked through the small opening of the tent, his heart stopped. Someone was sitting by the fire pit in the absolute darkness. It wasn't his brother, and it certainly wasn't his father. It was a fully grown man, sitting perfectly still in a chair, facing directly toward the tent. The physical posture of the man was incredibly rigid, and there was no doubt in Chris's mind that the man had seen him. Chris gasped, quickly pulled his head back inside, and zipped the tent shut. He scrambled back into his sleeping bag, desperately pulling the thin fabric over his head, hoping that this flimsy piece of cloth would somehow protect him from whatever was outside. Inside the tent, it was almost completely dark, save for the faint gray moonlight filtering through the fabric. Chris lay there, completely paralyzed with fear, trying not to make a single sound. His mind was racing. He wanted to call out for his dad, desperately hoping that the figure by the fire was just his father playing a trick or keeping watch, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. During that brief glimpse, he had seen enough to know the man was a stranger, and if it had been his dad, he would have acknowledged Chris when he poked his head out. Then, the silence was shattered by the sound of the chair by the fire pit shifting. Chris froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He prayed that the man wasn't getting up, or if he was, that he wasn't coming towards the tent. But then, a shadow fell over the fabric. The faint moonlight was blocked out as a large figure stood directly outside. Chris realized the stranger was standing right next to the tent. He decided to remain completely still, hoping the man would assume the tent was empty. But then, Chris heard the terrifying sound of the zipper slowly dragging downward. It only moved a few inches, creating a tiny opening at the bottom. The opening was small, but it was enough. Chris couldn't help himself. He turned his head just a fraction of an inch to look. He had never noticed it before, but there was a small gap at the very bottom of the tent where the zipper didn't fully seal. Pressed against that tiny gap was a single human eye. It was looking directly at him. Chris could see the stark white of the eye contrasting against the darkness. He was so paralyzed with fear that he couldn't even scream. He just stared back at the eye. Then the eye squinted slightly, as if the person on the other side was smiling a cold, hidden smile. The zipper moved another inch. That was the breaking point. Chris let out a terrified scream, scrambled backward, and kicked frantically, knocking over the tent poles and collapsing part of the structure. Immediately, he heard the sound of heavy footsteps taking off across the grass, running away into the darkness of the yard. A second later, the back porch light flipped on, illuminating the tent fabric. Chris's dad burst out of the back door, yelling loudly as he ran across the lawn. But by the time his dad reached the fire pit area, the intruder was already gone, disappearing into the dark patches of trees separating the yards. Chris's parents immediately called the police. Chris doesn't remember all the details of what happened next, but he remembers being taken into his parents' bedroom by his mom while the police searched the property and the surrounding woods. It was an absolute nightmare. Chris slept in his parents' bed that night, emotionally scarred by the realization of how close he had come to danger. For a while, things slowly began to return to normal. But a few weeks to a month later, something happened that cemented this experience as something Chris would never be able to forget. Chris attended a local Catholic school. During lunch, the students were allowed to have a short recess in the schoolyard, which was a large concrete area. The far end of the schoolyard was fenced off, looking out toward the street. Chris and his classmates were playing a game, perhaps red light, green light, though he doesn't fully remember the rules. All he knew was that he had to run to the fence to be safe from the threat in the game. As Chris stood by the fence alongside a few other kids, a man's voice called out from the other side. The man said, "Hey." Chris turned around and saw a man standing on the sidewalk, asking for directions to a place Chris had never heard of. Chris simply replied that he didn't know, keeping in mind the school's strict rules about not talking to strangers. But then, the man looked directly at him and said, "Your name is Chris, right?" At that exact moment, Chris felt his heart drop into his stomach. The man's voice, the look on his face, everything clicked. Chris quickly lied and said no. The man just smiled a chilling, familiar smile and whispered, "You don't remember me, do you?" Panic surged through Chris. He turned and ran as fast as he could toward one of the recessed chaperones, pointing back toward the fence. But by the time the chaperone looked, the man had already vanished. Another kid standing near the fence confirmed that they had seen the man too. The chaperones immediately ended recess, called all the students inside, and contacted Chris's parents. Chris was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that the man at the fence was the same person who had stared into his tent that night. Curious was taken home early that day. His parents were sick with worry, realizing that this predator was actively stalking their son. They lived in such a nice area, and the thought of being chased out of their own neighborhood by a stalker was a living nightmare. For months, Chris was kept under incredibly tight supervision. His parents watched his every move, never letting him out of their sight. Eventually, as time went on, the danger seemed to fade, and life returned to a normal routine. But even today, Chris still feels a painful tightness in his chest when he thinks about what might have happened if that man had successfully taken him. And he wonders if the predator was ever successful in whatever he was trying to do with someone else. Years passed, and Chris grew up. When he was 21 years old, he decided it was time to move out of his parents' home in Salem. He bought his first house about 50 miles away, a beautiful place that represented his independence. To furnish his new home, he collected a mix of items from his parents, family, friends, and various online marketplaces and local apps. At the time, Chris was driving a Ford Raptor, a massive truck that made transporting large items incredibly easy. One afternoon, while browsing Facebook Marketplace, Chris came across a listing that caught his eye. It was a digital yard sale with a seller listing a bunch of high-quality items for very cheap prices. Two specific items stood out to Chris: a pristine, cream-colored sectional couch and a high-end Cannondale mountain bike. Since Chris lived in an area perfect for outdoor exercise, a mountain bike was exactly what he needed. The rest of the items on the listing didn't interest him, but the couch and the bike were perfect. Chris contacted the seller on Facebook Messenger to negotiate. The seller was brief, direct, and surprisingly easy to deal with, quickly agreeing to a slightly lower price. They settled on a deal, and the seller told Chris he could come pick up the items later that evening. Since it was summer in Oregon, the days were long, meaning Chris would still have plenty of daylight when he arrived. Because of the size of the sectional couch, Chris planned on making at least 2 trips with his Ford Raptor. He entered the address into his GPS and set out. The map showed that the property was located right on the coast. Chris checked the satellite view on his map to confirm the location, and sure enough, it showed a massive property. A long tree-lined driveway veered off the main road, leading toward a large house perched on a hill, with the backyard dropping off directly into the Pacific Ocean. Chris couldn't help but marvel at the location, thinking that the owners must be incredibly wealthy. It made sense why they were selling their high-end items so cheaply. With that kind of money, they probably didn't care about making a profit. The drive didn't take long. As Chris got closer to the coastline, the properties became noticeably larger and more luxurious. Eventually, he turned onto the final road before the property's driveway. This road was long, isolated, and flanked by thick woods on both sides, with occasional driveways leading to hidden cliffside mansions. Finally, he reached the turnoff for the property. The driveway was a dirt road surrounded by dense trees. Chris drove down it for about 10 seconds before the path opened up into a massive, beautiful clearing. The driveway sloped gently upward, leading to a stunning mansion at the top of the hill. Chris pulled his Ford Raptor up to the house and parked next to an older, beat-up sedan. It looked like an old Mercury Sable, completely covered in dirt and wear. It was a complete contrast to the multi-million-dollar house, looking entirely out of place. Chris got out of his truck and walked up to the front door, ready to ring the doorbell. However, he noticed a bright yellow post-it note stuck to the glass. Written on the note was a message explaining that the doorbell was broken and asking visitors to please use the back door. Even though Chris easily could have just knocked on the front door, he decided to follow the instructions. He walked down the steps of the front porch and pulled out his phone, sending a quick message to the seller on Messenger to let him know he had arrived and was heading around to the back. As Chris walked along the side of the house, he glanced up at the windows he passed. Every single window had its blinds tightly closed, making it impossible to see inside. When he reached the backyard, he was breathless. The view was absolutely spectacular, overlooking the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. Chris walked up the steps of the back deck, heading toward the sliding glass door. A set of sliding blinds was closed over the glass, blocking his view of the interior. Chris knocked firmly on the glass. He stood there waiting for a minute, but there was no response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still silence. Chris looked down at his phone to see if the seller had read his message or replied. There was nothing. Thinking the seller might be in the shower or busy, Chris decided to pass the time by walking over to the cliffside to take a picture of the breathtaking ocean sunset. He walked down the steps of the deck and across the freshly cut grass to the edge of the cliff, enjoying the stunning view and daydreaming about one day being rich enough to own a home like this. After a few minutes, Chris decided to head back up to the house to try knocking again. But after taking only 3 steps, he stopped dead in his tracks. Every single window on the back of the house now had its blinds wide open, and standing in every single window was a person. They were standing perfectly still, like statues, staring directly down at Chris. Chris felt a cold wave of dread wash over him. He walked a little closer, trying to comprehend what he was seeing, wondering if this was some kind of elaborate prank. But then, he realized something that made his blood run cold. Every single one of those faces was smiling. They weren't just normal smiles. They were wide, unnatural, frozen grins. The people were so incredibly still that Chris couldn't even tell if they were real human beings or mannequins. The sight was deeply unnatural and terrifying. Chris decided right then and there that he had seen enough. He turned and began to jog back around the side of the house, wanting nothing more than to get back to his truck and leave. As he passed the side window, the one that had been tightly shut earlier, he noticed that the blinds were now lifted there too, and standing behind the glass was another person, smiling down at him. Kyrus sprinted the rest of the way to his Ford Raptor, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. He didn't even want to look at the front windows of the house, terrified of what he might see. He threw the truck into reverse and began speeding down the long dirt driveway. But as he backed away, curiosity got the better of him, and he glanced back at the house one last time. The front door of the mansion was now wide open. Standing on the front porch was a man with his hands in his pockets, silently watching Chris escape. Chris put the truck in drive, tore down the road, and didn't look back. The seller never opened or replied to his messages. Deeply unsettled, Chris pulled into the driveway of the closest neighbor's house and knocked on the door. An older man, whom Chris would call Tom, answered. Chris, still shaken and out of breath, explained the bizarre and terrifying situation he had just experienced at the house next door. Asking if Tom knew anything about the owners, Tom was visibly shocked. He explained that he was close friends with the homeowner, a man named Jim, and that Jim was hardly ever in town. Tom assured Chris that Jim was a quiet, professional man who would never set up an elaborate, creepy prank like that. On the spot, Tom pulled out his phone and called Jim. Jim answered, and Tom explained the situation, saying that a young man was at his door, claiming Jim had invited him over to buy furniture, only to be met with people smiling out of the windows. There was a long silence on the line before Jim asked what they were talking about. Chris stepped closer and explained everything, detailing the Facebook Marketplace listing, the sectional couch, the bike, the post-it note, and the smiling people in the windows. Jim's voice became filled with concern. He told Chris that he was out of town for the entire week, and that he had never posted any items for sale. Chris described the beat-up Mercury Sable and the man on the porch. Jim asked Chris to save his number so they could stay in touch after the police investigated the property. Chris agreed, but he decided to go straight home. He didn't have the energy to spend hours talking to the police about a situation that didn't directly involve him. Later that night, Jim called Chris to follow up. He asked Chris to send him a link to the Facebook listing, but when Chris checked, the ad had been completely removed. He sent Jim the details of the profile he had been messaging, but the account had been completely wiped and turned into a blank page. Jim thanked him and said he would pass the information to the investigators. When Chris asked what the police had found at the mansion, Jim's response was chilling. The police had arrived to find the property completely empty. The older sedan was gone, and all the blinds were closed once again. Nothing inside the house had been stolen, but all 3 of the mansion's doors had been left completely unlocked. To this day, Chris is haunted by the memory of those frozen, smiling faces staring at him from the windows. He constantly wonders what would have happened if he had followed the instructions on the post-it note and walked inside the house, and why those people wanted so badly to lure him into the secluded backyard. Our third case takes us to the quiet community of Murraysville, Pennsylvania, where another young man faced a terrifying home invasion that began with a seemingly innocent weekend plan. This young man lived with his parents in a beautiful home. The backyard of the property was an entertainer's dream, featuring an in-ground swimming pool and a large pool house. It was the perfect setup for parties, though he rarely had the opportunity to host them. The yard was incredibly private, surrounded by a small patch of grass that quickly gave way to a massive, dense forest. The woods behind the pool house were extensive, stretching back at least half a mile before reaching another residential property. Because of this, there were no public trails, and there was absolutely no reason for any strangers to be wandering through the trees. One weekend, the young man's parents went out of town, leaving him home alone. Sensing the perfect opportunity, he decided to host a small, casual pool party for his friends on Saturday night. Earlier that afternoon, he went out to the backyard to begin setting up. The sky was overcast, but since the party was scheduled for after dark, he didn't mind the gloomy weather, as he carried folding tables out to the lawn to set up for beer pong and refreshments. The quiet afternoon was interrupted by a distinct sound. A loud, deliberate cough echoed from the edge of the woods. It sounded like a deep, slow throat-clearing cough, unmistakably belonging to a man. The young man froze, holding a folding table in his hands. He stood perfectly still, listening closely. The wind was calm, barely rustling the leaves, allowing the sound to carry with terrifying clarity. The cough had come from just inside the tree line, only yards away from where he stood. Whoever had made the sound was close enough to see him clearly. Slowly, the young man set the table down and faced the trees. He was deeply unsettled. There was no logical reason for anyone to be in those woods. He scanned the dense foliage, trying to spot any sign of movement, and called out, asking who was there. There was no reply. The woods remained completely silent. There was no sound of footsteps, no branches snapping, no rustling of leaves to indicate that someone was walking away. This lack of movement made the situation even worse. If it had been a random hiker or a neighbor, they would have made noise moving through the brush. Instead, there was only dead silence. The young man was gripped by a powerful sensation of being watched. He felt as though someone was standing perfectly still behind a tree trunk, staring directly at him. He stood there for about 20 seconds, scanning the shadows, before the overwhelming discomfort became too much to bear. He quickly grabbed the remaining supplies, retreated inside the house, and locked the door. Not wanting to sound paranoid, he decided not to mention the incident to his friend Mark, who arrived at 6 p.m. to help him finish setting up. Mark brought drinks, and as they worked outside, the young man kept glancing toward the dark tree line. However, everything appeared normal, and the feeling of dread began to fade as his other friends started arriving. By 8 p.m., the party was in full swing. There were about 20 people gathered in the backyard, laughing, swimming, and playing music. With so many people around, the creepy woods no longer felt threatening. Still, a few times throughout the night, the young man found himself looking back toward the darkness beyond the pool house. Unable to fully shake the memory of the throat-clearing cough, by midnight, the party began to wind down, and by 1 a.m., the last of the guests had said their goodbyes and left. Exhausted, the young man decided to leave the cleanup for the next morning. Before heading upstairs, he performed a routine security sweep of the property. He walked around the pool, checked the area behind the pool house, and peered into the dark woods. Everything was peaceful, and the water in the pool was perfectly still, reflecting the patio lights. Satisfied that the yard was empty, he walked over to the sliding glass door, slid it shut, locked it securely, and headed upstairs to get ready for bed. He lay in bed for about half an hour, scrolling through his phone before finally putting it on his nightstand and closing his eyes. He spent another 30 minutes tossing and turning, trying to fall asleep, when the silence of the house was shattered by a loud splash. It was a heavy, distinct splash, not like a small animal falling into the water. It sounded exactly like someone jumping into the deep end of the swimming pool. The young man's eyes snapped open. He lay perfectly still, holding his breath and listening. A few seconds later, he heard the distinct sound of someone swimming, the rhythmic strokes of hands cutting through the water. His first thought was that one of his friends had stayed behind as a prank, or had returned to the yard. But he knew everyone who had attended the party, and none of them would do something so reckless and strange at 2 in the morning. He checked the time on his phone, and it was exactly 2 a.m. He quietly slipped out of bed and crept toward the window overlooking the backyard, careful not to turn on any lights in his room so he wouldn't reveal his position. He looked down at the pool. Under the bright pool lights, he saw a man swimming calmly from one end of the pool to the other. The young man leaned closer to the glass, trying to identify the swimmer. The pool lights illuminated the man's face, and the young man realized with absolute certainty that he had never seen this person before in his life. He opened the window slightly and yelled out, asking who the man was. The swimming stopped instantly. The stranger floated in the water, slowly lifting his head to look directly up at the bedroom window. He didn't look startled or confused, he just stared. Then, the man began wading toward the shallow end. He climbed out of the pool, revealing just how tall he was. He stood on the concrete deck, dripping wet, staring toward the house for a couple of seconds. The young man expected the intruder to run back into the woods. Instead, the man began walking directly toward the house. He wasn't running or hesitating. He was marching with a fast, determined stride, as if he knew exactly where he was going. The young man yelled out again, demanding to know who he was. The stranger didn't say a word. He reached the back sliding glass door. A second later, the young man downstairs heard the distinct sound of the sliding door opening. He was absolutely positive he had locked it, but the sound of the door sliding open and then sliding shut echoed clearly up the stairs. Panic seized him. He ran to his bedroom door, slammed it shut, and locked it, his hands shaking so violently he could barely turn the deadbolt. He grabbed his phone and desperately texted Mark, asking if anyone had stayed behind, but he didn't wait for a reply. He immediately dialed 911. In a trembling whisper, he told the emergency operator that an intruder had just entered his home. He gave his address as quietly as possible, trying to make no sound. And then he heard them. The sound of slow, wet footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors downstairs. He could hear the sticky, squelching sound of wet feet lifting off the wood. The intruder wasn't searching the house at random. He was walking directly toward the staircase. The steps began to creak, one by one, as the heavy, wet footsteps climbed higher. The man reached the top of the stairs. The hallway floorboards outside the bedroom groaned under his weight. Then the footsteps stopped. The intruder was standing directly outside the bedroom door. In the silence, the young man could hear the sound of water dripping steadily from the stranger's wet clothes onto the floor. Suddenly, the doorknob began to move. The stranger tried to turn it once, then twice, and then a third time, twisting it harder and more violently with each attempt. When he realized the door was locked, he stopped. The 911 operator was speaking through the phone, but the young man had set it down on the bed, unable to focus on her voice. He was staring at the door, paralyzed. Then came 3 slow, heavy knocks on the wood. The young man picked up his phone, put it on speaker, and yelled out as loudly as he could that he was on the phone with the police, and they were already on their way. A long, agonizing silence followed. Then, a deep, calm voice drifted through the door. The voice belonged to a grown man, likely in his 30s. He spoke in a low, measured tone, saying, "It's me. Open the door." The young man screamed back that he didn't know him and demanded that he leave immediately. There were another 5 seconds of silence. Then, the young man heard the wet footsteps turn and walk quickly down the hallway, heading back down the stairs. A few seconds later, the front door downstairs opened and slammed shut. The young man didn't move from his locked room until the police arrived. When he finally went downstairs to meet the officers, they found a clear, unmistakable trail of water leading from the back sliding door, across the living room, up the wooden stairs, and stopping right at his bedroom door. The police searched the property and the surrounding area, but the intruder had completely vanished into the night. When the young man messaged his friends the next morning, every single one of them confirmed that they had left at 1 a.m. and had not seen anyone lurking around. It was a complete stranger. The young man is convinced that the cough he heard in the woods earlier that afternoon belonged to the very same man who had likely been hiding in the trees, watching him set up, and waiting for the perfect moment to slip inside the house during the chaos of the party. The motive of the intruder remains a mystery, but the thought of what would have happened if the bedroom door had been left unlocked, continues to haunt the young man to this day. All three of these chilling incidents remind us of how vulnerable we truly are, even in our own homes or quiet neighborhoods. The predators in these accounts displayed a level of calculated patience and direct boldness that is deeply disturbing. From the silent figure watching a child camp in his own yard, to the coordinated and smiling group waiting in a mansion by the sea, to the uninvited swimmer who knew exactly how to navigate a locked house in the dead of night, these threats highlight a terrifying reality. We often believe that locking our doors and staying within familiar boundaries will keep us safe, but sometimes the danger finds a way to slide past our defenses. Fortunately, in all three of these cases, quick thinking, natural instincts, and a sudden escape prevented the situations from turning tragic. We may never know who those individuals were, or what their ultimate goals were, leaving behind a lingering dread that stays with the survivors long after the physical threats have faded. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.